the end of a great meeting, the end of a long day, and we're very proud to be part of the final plenary session on the grand challenges and part of the Keystone Symposia on drug discovery and innovation. So I'm going to start by introducing the panel, then give you an introduction to antimicrobial resistance, and then we're going to have a conversation. We've got a starry panel, and I can tell you they can be quite challenging. We've been trying this out upstairs. So on my left, we've got Stephen Baker, and he's Professor of Microbiology at the University of Oxford, but importantly for today's program, he is a leader in the Welcome program in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Next, we have Renu Swarup, who is Secretary of India's Department of Biotechnology since April 2018, and like me, a technocrat. And then we have Elmar Nijmegen. I don't think I'm saying that right. Sorry, Elmar. You'll have to give me some teaching on pronunciation, who has recently, very recently, joined the Global AMR R&D Hub here in Berlin as the lead for this, having worked in health research in the European Commission and a history of working in pharma. So why are we talking about this? Well, just think about the 700,000 people who die every year, and that's the minimum, because they get an infection that won't respond to antibiotics. And that is difficult to get hold of. The number that makes me stay awake at night is the 60,000 newborn babies dying of sepsis in India every year, which is resistant to infections. That's what we're talking about. Infections which are normal that we can no longer treat, and it's getting worse. And it's a very complex global threat, and if we don't get on top of it, and you're going to hear in the conversation that we aren't getting on top of it, this is going to get worse. And think about it. Antimicrobials, anti-infectives underpin modern medicine. Modern cancer treatment won't work without antibiotics and antifungi, etc., to treat the infections. We've heard about TB and malaria. If we can't treat them, there will be a loss of young, productive people. The sadness to the families, the disaster to the economy is there. I could go on from the health perspective, but this is complex because it's one health. We have overuse of antibiotics and antimicrobials and inappropriate use in the human sector, but also in the animal and agriculture sector, in the food chain. And then, of course, we all pee out antibiotics when we take them, and we all poo out resistant genes when we've got them, let alone what the animals, the fish, and everyone else do. So the environment is getting polluted with it. So this is really across every part of our lives. And I quite enjoy talking to young students, and many of them go surfing off the south of England. And you know, year on year, those surfing waters have a higher density of E. coli with antibiotic-resistant genes in them. They put themselves at risk, as we all do. So what are we going to do? Well, we've got to look after what we've got. That's called stewardship. And make sure they're used appropriately, whether it's in the animal or agriculture and human sector. But we need innovation. We need innovation to prevent infection. And I'm sure we'll get into vaccines and other things like that. But innovation, perhaps in the surfaces of healthcare and animal places. We need new drugs, and we're clearly going to talk about that. But you know, we pay peanuts for these drugs. Of course we should pay peanuts in low-income countries. They need access. But in rich countries, we have destroyed the market. So one after another, big pharmaceutical companies are leaving this area. We need to think about that market failure. we've got to do something about it because the commercial incentive seems to have gone. So today's conversation on drug discovery and innovation for AMR is incredibly timely, very important, and I think we're going to have a good conversation. And those themes you've already heard of partnership and collaboration are going to be here in the room as well. So let me start with Stephen. And Stephen, why don't you start by telling us what the most urgent priorities are facing the field of AMR research today from your perspective in Vietnam?
Okay, thanks, Sally, and thanks to everybody for coming. So I think it's good to put it into context before we start about what AMR means to me as a microbiologist working in Asia. I think part of the issues that we've been discussing here has very much been focused on healthcare settings in the West, where that is the biggest problem. We're worried about this era that we're moving towards of having untreatable infections. And actually, if you live and work in Asia now, we're actually already in that period of having untreatable infections. And it's not just in the hospital, but also now within the community. So community-acquired infections that we see quite commonly are resistant to every mainline antibiotic that we would like to give. So the problem really is out of control. I think that it's difficult to overstate that actually we are at the point now where most of the drugs that we've been using consecutively the last 20 years don't really have any activity. So it's not just a question then of what we do about infection and what we do about colonization. These two are intermingled with one another, that most of us living in Asia will be carrying these organisms around with us on a daily basis. And I think where the problem lies that we would like to tackle first, and I'm biased because this is my research area, is very much focused around gram-negative bacteria. And I was relaying this story to one of my colleagues earlier. I was asked a question about, of all the bacteria that I've ever worked on, which one is the most concerning? And actually, people find this a very odd answer, but if you have children, I've seen various cases of multi-drug-resistant Klebsiella pneumoniae bacteremia in Asia, and that is an absolutely terrifying prospect. So we need new approaches. We have lots of innovation. We have lots of technology. We have an amazing understanding of the way many of these bacteria cause infection. I think we need to start thinking in different ways, not only about using antibiotics to kill bacteria, but also different approaches with how we can limit the infection. The data is there, the information is there, the technology is there. I think we need to start thinking a little bit more laterally. And we listened to a fantastic talk the other day by Ugo Sahin about personalized cancer treatment. I think that then, why aren't we talking about personalized microbiology and actually moving into the era where actually we start treating the individual infection? We have the genomic information, combining the genomic information with some new innovative technology may actually help us to get us through a difficult period with respect to antibiotic usage.
Thank you. So let's now move on to Renu. So in India, what's the most urgent challenges that your country faces, and what are your primary efforts to understand and respond to that threat of AMR?
Thank you, Sally, and thank you very much for everyone being here. I think for India, AMR is a huge priority, as is for each one of us. I mean, that's the reason why we're all here today to discuss this. India being contributing to the global health security agenda, we have reiterated our commitment to combating and tackling AMR. And I think for us, the challenges are, as have been listed out in the global action plan. And I think India has very quickly responded to it by bringing out its own national action plan. And I think the national action plan that we've brought out clearly lists out our priorities. And the priorities are, in addition to the global priorities, also a priority on strengthening India's leadership into this. We have looked at all aspects from surveillance to preventing infection to R&D, innovation for new drug development, for bringing in new financing models and opportunities. And I think for us, the key challenge is also how we strengthen both our national and international partnerships. Within the Government of India, we have across ministries, the Indian Council of Medical Research, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, the Department of Biotechnology, Ministry of Science and Technology, all coming together to address this huge challenge. which we are working with all organizations, public, private, philanthropic, and we have many such partnerships. The international partnerships are also key to such efforts as we take on. But I think our recent announcement of the Mission AMR that we have made to bring in the R&D innovation has brought the spotlight on what our focus is. We have very recently notified the first national repository on pathogenic AMR pathogens, and I think that's been the first huge step to bring out our priorities in terms of addressing all the challenges that we have in AMR. We are also trying to look at in terms of capacity building. I think that's a serious and important challenge for us, that as we take forward capacities both in terms of human resource and infrastructure, and through international partnerships, bringing some of the best practices, global practices to the country, recognizing very clearly that India is the one who can contribute a lot to the whole global challenge. And this, as I said, has been reiterated by our Prime Minister and the Minister when we had our workshop in 2016, which was very well attended, and our commitment to the WHO agenda. So that's huge for us. All areas are a priority with special focus on seeing how we can combat AMR.
Yes, this problem of all areas are a priority, I absolutely agree with, but I think we'd all also cheer you on that just as we've heard you can do made in Africa, we can have made in India. We need made everywhere. And the partnership theme takes us on to Elmar. Yeah. So you've just joined the Global AMR R&D Hub. We launched it in May. And how are you going to improve coordination of international efforts to tackle it? What are your major priorities up front?
Yeah. Thank you, Sally, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's really a great honor to be here on the panel with such a distinguished roster of guests. So let me just start by saying a few words on the raison d'etre of the Global AMR R&D Hub. So in this hub, we want to bring together governments and foundations from different regions of the world to combat the global threat of AMR. We want to do this by addressing global R&D priorities while respecting national and of the different organizations, their priorities. So thus, we promote high-level coordination of public and private funding and activities and leveraging much-needed further money going into this area. Concretely, our first deliverable will be what is called a dynamic dashboard. So we want to build on existing sources of information that are available around the world, and we want to bring the information on research and development activities from the public, but also to the extent possible from the private sector, into one place so that very quickly you can find what's being done across the world in R&D in this very challenging space. There are repositories of very detailed and dedicated information for certain parts of the picture, but there is currently no place where you have the whole picture. And in this space, we believe it is important and very helpful to have this global overview, and that's really what we want to deliver. We will start by looking at and bringing together the information on the human health-related research, but as has already been alluded to, that can only be a start because human health is very much dependent on the situation in the animals, in the use of antimicrobials in agriculture, and then also the effects of antimicrobials and how they appear in the environment. And so we really want to expand, once we have established the dynamic dashboard, we want to expand it to include really all those areas in a true One Health approach. The other thing that is really important is to bring more money into this space and to also think of new ways of bringing money into this challenging area. And indeed, throughout the meeting, it has really been very encouraging and very exciting to hear so many talks and also people talking about really doing things in new ways. And but clearly, we do need more investments. And one of the charges that has been given to me and the Secretariat by my board of members, which agreed on a work plan, which we have been able to publish earlier this week, is that with the next board meeting, which we will hold in autumn next year, we will hold a workshop together with the board meeting on how we can really leverage more investments and bring in more investments in this space. And then finally, something we will work on also is to really look at incentives, on how the different incentive structures can work in synergy with each other. And I think with these three elements of bringing in more investment in the first place, providing us a central place of information on global R&D activities in a One Health approach, and also looking at incentives and how we can better use them is going to be the contribution of the global R&D hub.
So let's pick up on this issue of finance, because people are always saying to me, oh, Sally, can't you get more money into the field? Well, that's probably public finance, and the human sector seem to think it should always be public, whether it's foundation or government. But the animal sector and agriculture, it's much more private, and that takes you also into, can you get their data when it's private? Why are we so reliant on the public sector? Is this right, or do we need innovative financing mechanisms?
Well, I think clearly we need both. We do need public investment, and this is really a space where I think it can be very well justified to do it. First of all, this is, as we have really heard throughout the conference, a very challenging area of research, and even some of the panelists have already alluded to it. The other thing is that the discoveries that one private enterprise may make may not actually benefit that particular enterprise, but actually another one. So we have this challenge that the organization that discovers may not be the one who can benefit from it. And these two problems of very challenging situation from the science and the medicine and the organizational structures that we have in our countries, combined with this problem of not being able to be sure that I will be able to benefit from it, that already that leads to a lower investment from the private sector than would be desirable by society. That also then leads to the fact that this public investment that so many players and the charitable investment that's coming in actually will not crowd out private investment, as economists would call it. Rather, the opposite should happen, that by bringing in public and charitable funding, we actually encourage other investors, private investors, to come with their own funds. And so we really need both sides, but there is a good case to be made for bringing in the public and charitable funding. And then another aspect, and with that I close on this, is that we really need a lot of coordination between different sectors, different players, all across the world. And that is something that the private sector typically is not so good at in this very challenging environment. So they are good at coordinating, production chains and many other things, but bringing really together from, we need social innovation in this space to lots of scientific innovation, and that is something that really this charitable and public investment can do quite a bit better.
So Renu, do you want to come in on this public versus private funding?
Sally, I would actually agree with Elma that this is an area where we can actually justify the public funds being put in as the initial catalyst. Public funds are always looked as a catalyst to be able to take up the high-risk research, and specifically for areas such as this, which is for the public good. The private sector would come in the moment there is a market pull for the product that they're bringing out. I think the private sector engagement in this whole area of AMR, as we talk about it, is more from bringing in their new technologies, looking at research, but the catalyst and the push would come from public, which would be both the government and also the philanthropic and charitable funds that come in. But I think AMR is too complex an issue to be left to any one group or any one organization. It needs a combination of all organizations, the government, the public, the private, and the society. So it's not just the investment component of the partnership which is crucial and critical, which the government can play or the public funds can play an important role, but I think it's their involvement in it which is important. So bringing the private sector on board as key players, key stakeholders for driving this agenda to its complete fulfillment is crucial and critical. Of course, yes, their investments are important, but maybe not the main critical factor if we have to get their involvement to drive an AMR-related agenda.
Trouble is, at the moment, we're failing. But Stephen, let me ask you something that's related. It's often said to me that the North is very worried about this, but the problem's in the South, yet it's the North putting most of the money in. I think that's why the Gates Foundation is so important, actually, to try and put the low and middle income country perspective. What do you think's going on? Are we addressing the issues that matter?
Well, we're not addressing where the main density of the problem is. So, like I said earlier, the AMR landscape is very different in the north compared to the way we think about it in the south. And we know more about it in the north potentially because this is where the density of science and research and development is, so it's more focused there. But I think it is a global challenge. The organisms, as we've seen from many of the talks that we've had the last few days, they don't stick to particular borders or populations of humans or animals. They move around. We have an international food chain. We have international travel. That actually these problems are on their way north, whether we like them or not. And I think that actually by tackling more at the root of the problem and focusing more on where the problem is, we'll probably have not only short-term results for those living and working in Asia, but also longer-term results for what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere as well.
So that actually takes us into, will we do better getting the funds in if we talk about security in the north and solidarity in the south? And I wonder whether anyone wants to talk to that.
Well, I would just say one thing, and since you spoke about the Gates funding coming in, since in India we've got the Grand Challenges India, which has actually looked at a lot of this funding coming in. And I think the AMR was a very good example because this was actually a global AMR in which we had 3 countries coming together to launch this. So this was a clear indication of not just the funds coming in, but the solidarity of the countries coming together for a commitment that was as important as the AMR. And I think which this Grand Challenges has just closed. And what was important was not just bringing the countries in, but the Gates funding, which connected these countries, brought the innovators together. And I think more than anything else, bringing the innovators from different countries, different continents, onto a common platform to address a common topic, I think that's important. That solidarity is really crucial to any of these sort of commitments. And I think it's also the learnings that we get from it, taking the best practices from one, because it's not only the research and innovation in new technology, but it's also the implementation strategies which are important. And I think those implementation strategies vary from each of the countries, from each of the geographies as we look at it, and that learning brings in a lot of experience to the partners. So that's how important global funds are, funds which come in, which can actually bind groups together, connect them together, and then help in deliveries to happen. So I feel that's very important and crucial.
Good. So we need science, and I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these things, but we also need to steward, to look after the antibiotics we've got, and that takes behavioural change, doesn't it? What would you do if you could in Vietnam to look after the antibiotics?
In many respects, it's too late. I think that if we had...
So if we get a new antibiotic, what are you going to want?
So if we got a new antibiotic that came online within the next few months in Vietnam, the process to maintain it or to maintain its usefulness would be probably best to have it in a hospital setting and used for only particular conditions of where there's a diagnostic result that's indicative of requiring that antimicrobial. The moment the drug gets lost into the community or is starting to be used without appropriate diagnostic procedures, then we begin to lose control of it. So, as I said earlier, resistance is inevitable. If we introduce a new drug, then resistance will emerge at some point. It's how long we can maintain the utility of that drug and buy time to develop additional drugs or identify additional targets in that period. So I think maintaining it and using it for people that require it on the back of an appropriate diagnostic test is probably the best approach. Whether that's feasible given the way the drug markets and also access to antimicrobials work outside of the US and Europe, I'm not sure. But it's something that probably we need to start thinking about how we change government policy as well as people's behaviour.
Absolutely. So, Renu, tell us about what India's been doing to try and make sure that antibiotics are used sensibly by prescription only, because that's not possible in your country. You've got too many people and not enough doctors and nurses.
That's a huge challenge for us. I wouldn't say that we are there right now, but I think the intent has been made clear through our action plan. I think it's important for us to now have, of course, the good policy measures that need to come out, but also to have a proper system in place through our national and health system, so that unless and until we have a proper diagnosis, there is no way that the prescriptions could be brought in. So currently where we are positioned is we do have the intent to be there, but there is a lot of policy that needs to go around it to be able to make it mandatory. We are governed by the health being a state subject, so it's from the federal government we can actually bring in the action plans. It's wonderful to have action plans on paper. For them to be implemented, you need to work with the stakeholders. India, the complexities are so much that getting these stakeholders, getting the various state governments, you can't really sort of put in prescriptions in place and say that they have to see value in it. And once we convey that value, I'm sure they would be able to take that.
I mean, you're right, the complexity is terribly difficult in getting the intersectorality. But tell us about your red line system and how it's working out.
I don't think we are fully there right now.
Many people may not know what it is, so you might want to explain.
So I think it's important to see that how do we work on this in terms of what really is how do we connect the surveillance to the actual implementation? That's really what part of it is there. So as I said, it's more of a policy issue that needs to drive it. And I think currently, well, it's on, it's there, but I think the policy still needs to be around to make it work fully the way we need to take it forward. So that's a challenge for us. As a part of our National Action Plan and part of working with the various state governments, we have been able to discuss this. Some of the state governments are proactive into it, who've been able to take it forward, but in some cases we still need to do more of the various aspects that need to be brought in terms of the behavioral changes, in terms of actually working with them to see how they can adopt it and take it forward.
What about poor quality medicines? Is that an issue in Vietnam?
It's not something that we've invested a great deal of time and energy investigating. We've certainly done some work trying to look at particular different classes of antibiotics and what's in them. There is a big problem in parts of Asia with fake medicines being distributed through the system. I guess the question is, what do those contain? I guess antibiotics with nothing in are possibly better than antibiotics with low amount of antibiotic in a way. Yeah, but it's also a great problem, how we then control appropriate manufacturing processes, and making sure that we not only, as we mentioned, source our antibiotics ethically, but also making sure they're made under specific, good manufacturing practices to make sure they actually got in them what we think they've got in them.
So, Elmar, surveillance and understanding the problem clearly has to be part of this. Are you going to try and collect any data on what's going on about surveillance, or are you going to stick to R&D and innovation?
Well, I think when you present this global and high-level overview of what's going on, I would see that as the kind of numerator of a fraction, and then of course that has to be somehow put into context of the denominator, which is what is the challenge out there. Now, with the very limited resources the global AMR R&D hub has, we will not go out and do new look for new surveillance data, but I think we will have to really correlate that, and I think there is global efforts at getting good surveillance data from the WHO through the GLASS system. Of course, in the Western jurisdictions such as North America and in Europe, we do have our own separate systems. But so I think I clearly have the plan to put that into context. How we will do exactly that is to be seen.
It's an interesting problem because there's quite a lot of surveillance going on, but is it publicly available? And then with the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, we've funded the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation to include AMR in the global burden of disease. And they've started to look for, so if you've got resistance, does it change the outcome? What's the burden? And there's remarkably little evidence about that as it happens. So here we are all winging it a bit by the seat of our pants that this matters and it's important, but the hard evidence isn't there. How are you managing surveillance in India?
So the Indian Council of Medical Research has actually now set up its surveillance centers, and I think a number of them have been planned, some of them have already taken off. So that's the major network, and the size and the vastness of it obviously makes the problem totally complex. But there is an action plan, there is a whole plan in which the Indian Council of Medical Research has now taken this on. But I think now what is important is, as you rightly said, that while we do have these surveillance centers which are in position or which will be coming up as they get further strengthened, it's the data that comes from them which needs to be collected into a common repository or a common database which can be made accessible. Because having this data in different sort of parts of the country or even within the globe in different parts is not really going to be very helpful. So while we do need to focus on collecting the data, I think the compilation of the data, the curation of the data, and then being able to analyze the data, that's an important factor which we need to look at in addition to the collection of the data under the surveillance aspect.
Absolutely. Our experts were telling me only this week that we do not have immediate diagnostic tests, though we've been looking for one with the Longitude Prize for a long time now, but that what you needed to know was the prevalence of resistance. So you had guidelines for that particular area, and that was your starting point while you waited for the lab diagnostics. So if we don't do the surveillance, we can't have the right guidelines. So it's about how do we do that. But then you've got the behavioral thing. How do we impact the community? And you brought in the community, Stephen. How can you change prescribing? At the moment, people buy them over the counter, don't they?
Yeah.
In markets.
Markets anywhere. I mean, I buy them over the counter as well. I think that when they're
do you know they're any good?
Well, I don't know. It's a good question. N equals 1 is never a good sample size for any study. So there is two aspects of this. So first of all, antibiotics are used, given, as you like, to be almost an insurance policy. So they are they're the go-to drug of choice. People ask for them, and also doctors are keen to prescribe them because there's a huge amount of people visiting healthcare facilities, there's a huge amount of people requiring treatment, and actually they seem to be the go-to drug. They're cheap, and if you don't have a resistant infection, they work. And actually
assuming it's...
Well, that's what I was going to say, assuming that actually it's bacteria in the first place. But then the downstream assumption of that is that if you take an antimicrobial to which you don't have a bacterial infection anyway, then it has no consequences. And that is the crux of the problem, that's what needs to change. Actually, there is consequences of taking antibiotics unnecessarily. We're not good at actually working out directly what they are, but we're observing the problems of this on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and it's getting worse. So therefore, it's a human behavioral change, but also it's a healthcare change. Then actually we need to think more about how we use antibiotics, about how doctors prescribe them, and also about people requesting them and wanting them. There was a fantastic slide the other day presented about how antimicrobial sales in prescriptions in the US correlated with flu. I mean, this is clearly then a problem not just in Southeast Asia, but also in the US and in Europe. So I think there needs to be a complete sea change in the way we think about using antibiotics to treat non-specific infections.
So we're back to behavioral and research and social sciences and actually behavioral economics, nudging. We did a piece of work about a year ago to decide how to do a television campaign to save our antibiotics. And we learnt two things that I didn't know. The first was that the public said, when a doctor or nurse says you don't need an antibiotic, they might be trying to save money because the state pays for the antibiotic, so they didn't like that. The second was that they felt validated they were sick when they were given a prescription because they could ring up work and say, hey, I'm sick, I've got an antibiotic. So we did two things as a result of that. The first is our TV ad, which is going out again in October for World Antibiotic Awareness Week, is dancing antibiotics, not doctors saying don't do it. look after us, you want us to last. And the second is Public Health England designed prescription sheets for when they weren't prescribing antibiotics. You are ill, your problem is, tick, this is our advice, paracetamol, fluids, rest, to get the patients to feel validated they were sick. And that, the qualitative research has shown, has been really useful.
Okay.
So we've been looking at all sorts of behavioral interventions to reduce prescribing. But there's another bit of science that we need, and you and Renu may have a view, which is how long should people take antibiotics for? You know, and what dose? So we used to have a standard dose, but our population has got fatter. Does that alter the dose we need to give them? And we have standard time periods. But is that too long when patients want to stop when they run out of money in Vietnam or when they feel better? What about that?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. It depends very much on the organism and the condition, but I think for dosing, we're pretty good at working out PK/PD for various drugs and knowing, you know, what the optimal dose is to get the threshold above the MIC of the organism. I think for dosing schedules, about how long they last for, I mean, I don't think there's a lot of science behind much of that. So actually getting back to some basics and actually working out whether a 2-day course of antibiotics is better than a 5-day course, not only for treating the infection, but also for the longitudinal effect of what happens after you've been treated with that drug. If you like, the kind of collateral effect of taking an antibiotic for a short period compared to a long period, I mean, that data doesn't really exist. So I think that getting back to basics and doing some work like that to not only try and reduce the emergence of resistance, but also reduce the amount of time that we're actually exposing people to drug would be a fantastic place to start.
So different types of research are needed.
Yes, I would agree with that there's more science that needs to be, you know, for the evidence. But I think going back to the behavioral part that you spoke about, I think that's important and not only for conveying the message, either through television campaigns or through others, but also trying to explain to the public, mainly also in terms of the dose, because you said rightly, because the moment they feel a little better, they're not sure whether they want to continue with the antibiotic or not. So I think it's the behavioral aspects which really need to be handled more than anything else for us to see whether we need to help.
And of course those will be cultural, won't they, as well? So they could be different in all our countries, and that'll make collecting the data for you, Elmar, particularly interesting.
Yes, and I would just like to add on what has already been said, that indeed innovation in drug discovery and in this really challenging space does not, of course, we do need new medicines. We need them urgently, but we also need other types of research and innovation. So we need innovation on how do we really administer the medicines, on how do we get buy-in from those actors in the system who are either buying the medicine or who are prescribing it. And we've heard lots of great presentations at this meeting and in other situations that this is really some research to be done, and there's a lot of innovation to be had also from that side of the spectrum.
And in the IACG, we've coined this concept of AMR specific, and we've been talking about that, and AMR sensitive. So flu vaccination, pneumococcal vaccination are AMR sensitive. They reduce bacterial infections, therefore they impact on our AMR, and we need that as well, and we need to encourage vaccinations. Which vaccine would you like to see produced next? Which would make a difference to you?
Well, there's a lot of people interested in vaccines in the room, so
yeah,
it depends
but
who
you're the one practicing.
Depends who I want to make friends with. So actually, as I said earlier, actually the only organism, not the only organism, but one of the chief organisms that we've worked on that I'm most terrified about is Klebsiella pneumoniae. I think that actually it's not an easy organism to work with, and it's not an easy organism to make a vaccine to, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And I know there have been multiple efforts to make various conjugate vaccines against Klebsiella pneumoniae. But actually I think that the vaccine area in gram-negatives, so to prevent particularly against gram-negative sepsis, whether there's a market for it and whether the incidence is high enough, or whether it could be used as a kind of prophylactic, in areas where there's a high incidence, I would like to see development go into to understanding more about how we develop vaccines against organisms like Klebsiella pneumoniae and E. coli.
So some difficult science there.
Yeah, because it's like anything. If it was easy, it would have been done already. These organisms are incredibly complicated. It's very difficult to find 2 E. coli and 2 Klebsiella that are the same. So trying to identify cross-reactive antigens that may protect against a whole range of different organisms within those genesis is going to be incredibly complicated. And that means then focusing on individual capsular variants or antigen variants and whether they can be combined to have a pan response against a multitude of different serotypes is actually not particularly well known. So, but I think it's a big challenge, but one that actually we should be facing up to and thinking about.
So that then takes us into, if we get the vaccines, can we put them out there? And clearly there's funding and logistics, but increasingly in the north, we're getting anti-vaxxers who say, we know better than you, we don't want vaccines. And is that a problem in India? Is it a problem in Southeast Asia that we're going to have to do the social sciences and think about?
It's maybe Southeast Asia, but I would say in India, we're now looking at what are the new vaccines that really need to come out. So there's a whole lot of focus which is coming out on the vaccine development mainly. So I think that's really the priority for us. And in terms of the new vaccines that we've had groups discussing about the various vaccines, within this Grand Challenges meeting itself, new vaccine development. So I think for us, immediately the priority is which are the new vaccines that we can bring to the table and how do we actually have them ready for our universal immunization program. So that's really the topmost priority for us in terms of new vaccine development.
There's a big anti-vaccine movement in parts of Vietnam. Yeah, so there's been some fairly high-profile problems with some locally sourced vaccines where there has been some unpleasant side effects of some of the vaccines that have been given, and therefore there has been movements in certain parts of the country to stop immunization in certain locations, particularly in certain minority groups, which has resulted in several large outbreaks of measles and other things. So yeah, there is a large anti-vaccine movement, and generally this kind of mistrust in vaccines isn't limited to what's going on in the north, but actually it is spreading throughout parts of Southeast Asia as well, which is a huge potential problem.
So, 2 issues. One is the misunderstandings and perhaps fake news type of thing, but the other that you've just brought up, which is very important, is the quality of the manufacturing. And that takes us back to partnership, which was one of the themes we wanted to explore. How do we ensure that we're developing, whether it's the drugs or the vaccines, high quality, affordable, and India's led the way on cheap vaccines that are high quality, haven't you?
Ethical.
And ethical, yes. Do you want to explore that?
I think maybe Elmar might be more suitable.
Well, first, just briefly on the partnerships bit, I think to take forward these new interventions, whether it's new medicines or new vaccines, of course, is a very challenging task. We already heard, the introductory speech on this drug development, which were very inspiring, by the way. Thank you very much for that. So we do need, we know that the big integrated companies are able to do that, but for some economical reasons, they are not so interested in these projects anymore. So what we have to do is we really, in a way, have to cobble together, the different bits and pieces, as we've heard. And also as a project funder in this area for a number of years, I can say that we do need some industrial partners in here because academia and research institutes just do not have the end-to-end expertise in this sphere to bring everything together. But then, indeed, we need partnerships to then have, like blocks, if I may call it that, where, the academia does a lot of work in maybe the preclinical, in the discovery space. Then we have accelerators like CARBEX, and in the IMI program, we have people who are really taking care and investing in the block of bringing things to being ready for clinical testing. And then we need to really still explore a bit on how we're going to do the partnerships for the clinical testing. And then on the, what I should actually wanted to have said earlier, that on the stewardship part, for example, all those new initiatives and somewhat of them already a little bit older initiatives do have very strong stewardship provisions in the research grants from the very beginning. So we really, I think the community is aware that this is an important aspect to be considered. And then indeed, once we get to products that are ready to be put on the market and to be maintained on the market, which is something we also need to think about and how we can really ensure that we don't just get to approval, but that we have availability of relevant stockpiles in the relevant markets over the years. We need to produce these things in a way that is appropriate and ethical. You know, many consumers nowadays demand for their T-shirts and consumer products that they are produced in an ethical manner. And maybe we have to actually start looking at that also for the medical interventions, the medicines, for which the active components, or at least part of them, do come from all over the world, sometimes with unclear origin. And that's, I think, that for big retail chain is not acceptable anymore. And yet in the pharma business that seems to be acceptable. So there is really some new thinking that we need also in that space.
So I just want to unpack that, because you said it, but I wonder if it was clear to the audience that as antibiotics and antimicrobials are manufactured, you start with active ingredients and you put them together. There is, from some factories, effluent, there's waste going out, poisoning the environment. But of course it happens from high runoff from intensive farming and from hospitals if you don't have good sewage management. There's a study of a class of school children in a country not represented here, where they had no antibiotics in the preceding 3 months, but a large number of them had antibiotic residues in their urine. In other words, it was in the water or the food that they were taking. So ethical means clean and protecting the environment and the people around. I just wanted to unpack it. But let me pick up on stewardship, because you mentioned CARB-X and GARD-P have stewardship in their contracts. But actually, what does that mean? It means don't sell it when it shouldn't be used, so make less money. How are we going to resolve that? What are we going to do about it?
Well, that is a million-dollar question that really I think many people are grappling with. I don't have, a quick and ready answer. If I had it, I don't think I would be sitting here. I think we really need to think very hard on, what are the approaches. A lot of work has been going into this direction. And we really need to be, I think, open to also new approaches. Again, here at the conference, we've heard presentations from an Indian company, which very clearly said, well, we're going to go it, in a different way, because the traditional way is not going to work for us. So I think, I also think I'm convinced that there's not one way of going forward. We will really need all kinds of ideas and all kinds of approaches, because, really the challenge is so different. I mean, Klebsiella pneumonia, which is a huge problem, not just in Southeast Asia. At the World Health Summit, there was talks from Nevada, so you don't want to go into a hospital or nursing facility in Nevada for the moment. We have really a big issue with a lot of different bugs and a lot of different resistance patterns. And then indeed we talked about or touched upon the preventative interventions. So I think we need to really look at what is the particular case, what is the particular situation, and really bring all kinds of approaches to bear.
He's really good. He sidestepped stewardship, but I would have done if I were you too, so well done. Renu, you were going to talk to R&D and collaborations and partnerships.
Yes, Sally, I think it's, as I said right in the beginning, partnerships are crucial for any such global agenda to be driven. And from India, we're very clear that both the national and international partnerships are very important for us. We've seen wonderful examples. You spoke about affordable, accessible vaccines. Our rotavirus vaccine was an excellent example of public-private partnership. partnership with global funders to take this forward. And today we have it in our universal immunization program. Similarly, we are looking at connecting public and private sector within our ecosystem. We have a wonderful innovation ecosystem. The grand challenges we spoke about, our partnership for the AMR, Carbex. We have the first Carbex accelerator for Asia in Bangalore. We are very happy about it. We have the first Indian company which was supported and initially initiated by us to get a Carbex grant. And we are looking at more such collaborations. We are actually now talking about innovative collaboration models in which we could collaborate with Carbex. We've also had and shown our interest from India to partner with the global AMR R&D hub. I think those are partnerships which would be very important. We already have a partnership with the Longitude Prize where we have an India Discovery Fund that we have brought in, which again was a very unique, innovative, collaborative partnership model. So I think we'll have to be innovative not only in terms of the various funding and financing options, but also in partnership models if we have to come together globally to address this challenge.
I think you've just demonstrated that India is very innovative and a leader in that. And if you could target funding, which would be your top priority at the moment? You and I agree there isn't, but go on, try for one.
So, so I think it's definitely the therapeutics, the diagnostics, which would look at. It's the new R&D innovation in terms of looking at new product development. So be it the vaccines, the therapeutics, or because you do have to bring in new tools. As I said, surveillance would get much better. I mean, you would look at even prescriptions getting better if you have proper prevention of infections, you have proper diagnostics to take that forward.
Shigella. You were talking about Shigella. Do you want to talk about it here?
I can talk about Shigella all afternoon if you like, but we haven't got that long left. Which aspects of Shigella?
Well, just the overuse of antibiotics and how it's resistant to everything anyway.
So we've done quite a lot of work on Shigella. It's one of my pet organisms, if you can have a pet organism, I guess. And we've observed a worrying trend and followed this multi-drug resistant organism as it's kind of hit Vietnam and then spread across the country, acquiring drug resistance genes pretty much at will. And it started actually, emerged an organism that came from other parts of Asia, and it was fluoroquinolone resistant. The interesting aspect about this is that we've also looked at what happens in hospitals and most kids when they get dysenteric diarrhea, certainly in Vietnam and other parts of Asia as well, get given an antibiotic empirically, which is usually fluoroquinolone. So actually then we're kind of compounding the problem whereby we know that there's fluoroquinolone-resistant Shigella, and then actually we're providing more of it to kids when they have dysenteric diarrhea. And they seem to get better, so the question is whether they actually need it in the first place at all, right? So we need better understanding of what the drugs are actually doing and when we need to use them and when we don't need to use them, rather than just giving them empirically.
A problem. And it'll be a problem wider than just Vietnam. It'll be all Southeast Asia and further. So we're coming to an end, and I wondered if you'd each believe there's a fairy godmother out there. I'm clearly not it. What, if that fairy godmother could wave their wand, would you like, Elmar, to happen in this field? We're talking about innovation to combat antimicrobial resistance.
Well, I think what I really hope can happen, and I'm quite optimistic that we should be able to implement it, is that we should really accelerate, and thanks to technology, thanks to better organization, thanks to new partnerships, the clinical development of these compounds. Because we do need new antimicrobials. It is a rather short intervention typically, which the exact duration we need to determine, as we heard earlier today. But in any case, it's going to be a week or 10 days or so. With technology, we should be able, at least in the clinical trial setting, be better able to identify who are the patients who really are susceptible to this new intervention, to really get through the process much more quickly. Because if we do that, then of course that changes the whole economics. Because in these calculations, time is of the essence.
So you would like innovative ways of bringing drugs through to test them and get them into the clinic.
And get the the information, because of course many of those will still have some issues, but we need the answers as quickly as possible. And we have a good pharmacodynamic marker in anti-infective development from the very beginning. which in many other drug development programs we don't have, and I have some experience there. But so we have also something going for us, and we shouldn't forget that.
Renu.
Well, difficult to have one wish for such an important problem, but I think I would love to see accelerated technology innovation for One Health for addressing the needs of one world. I think that's really what we would love to see.
I love that.
So I think there's a lot of innovation here. I think there actually are many fairy godmothers sitting in the room that have this already. I think that antibiotics are great, but they have problems in the way they act like a nuclear bomb rather than being a specific tool. I think that I would like to see more innovation in understanding how we can kill bacteria without the use of broad-spectrum antimicrobials and have more targeted medicine to kill individual bacteria that are causing the problems. So that's what I would wish for.
So that's a nice one. More innovation. I would argue we've got to sort the market failure in order to pull innovation through. So the final thing I'm going to ask you all before we hand over is, what keeps you awake at night? Now, I don't want to know about the family. I'm talking about antimicrobial resistance. I think you said Klebsiella, but...
Klebsiella pneumoniae, bacteremia, particularly in children and neonates, keeps me awake at night. Having worked in several different places where we've had devastating outbreaks of it on neonatal ICUs with 60, 70, 80% mortality, and children dying within kind of 48 hours of being into the ward, is probably the scariest situation to be in, with doctors scratching their heads about what they can actually do because there aren't any drugs available on the shelf that they can be given. Yeah, so that's what's keeping me awake at night.
I think it's the vastness and the complexity of the problem and the fear that you may actually, if we don't accelerate our technology development, we may suddenly not have any antibiotic left to treat any of us. And you did mention the large numbers of neonatals. This will sort of multiply tenfold if we don't address it right now. I think that's worrisome to see. We need to handle it.
It's a powerful push to do something, isn't it, Elmar?
Well, the challenge is very large, but I'm a bit worried that by having this big challenge, we go to policymakers and then they say, well, there's nothing we can do about it, so it's bad, it's so bad, and I would hope that we can also bring a sense of, there is something we can do, and by bringing together the relevant players, by having the partnerships, we can actually do something about it, and I would want us to keep that sense of being the masters of our fate in a way.
Yes, so I'm a doctor, and I used to look after patients with sickle cell disease and children with leukemia. I still see the faces and the names of those who died of infection and remember the resistant ones. I don't want people to go on seeing that. The family's suffering, the baby's dying, the family's suffering. So I think we all share that desire to make a difference with all of you out there. So thank you for joining us and listening. Well done, team.